The night in Jalisco feels alive in a way that is almost unsettling. The mountains are draped in darkness, their jagged silhouettes cutting against a silver moon that hangs low and heavy, casting pale light over the thick forest below. Somewhere in those mountains, perhaps only a few miles away, lives a man whose name sends a shiver through entire governments, a man who has turned remote Mexican countryside into an impenetrable fortress. His name is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, though the world knows him as El Mencho, the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere, the elusive ghost at the center of a billion-dollar criminal empire. Tonight, we step quietly into his world, following the echo of stories whispered in cantinas, the rustle of leaves carried by the wind, and the distant sound of a lone dog barking in a village that has long since learned never to ask too many questions. This is not merely a story about crime, it is a story about survival, about ambition forged in poverty, about a man who became a myth even as he walked among the living. Imagine the quiet of the mountains as the clock passes midnight. Somewhere, deep in the hills, a fire crackles softly. Perhaps El Mencho is there, seated under the stars, drinking black coffee in silence, planning his next move. Perhaps he is far away, hidden in yet another safe house, a figure wrapped in shadows, his mind always working, always anticipating the next raid, the next betrayal. He has been hunted for years, and yet, every time, he slips away. Every time the authorities claim to be closing in, he vanishes like mist at dawn. It is this ability to disappear, to exist, and not exist at once, that has earned him his ghostly reputation, a man more rumor than reality, more legend than flesh. But before the legend, there was the boy. And before the boy became a cartel boss, he was a son of Michoacan, born into the dusty fields and hard labor that shaped so many lives in Mexico's rural heartland. To understand El Mencho, to understand how he became the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, we must return to that beginning. For his story is not just one of violence, it is also one of transformation, of a child of poverty who refused to remain powerless, who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be if he dared to take it by force. The story of Nemesio Oseguera is a story told in low voices, in dimly lit rooms, where people glance at the door before speaking his name. For some, he is a Robin Hood figure, a protector, a man who brought money and infrastructure to places forgotten by the government. For others, he is a ruthless warlord, responsible for rivers of blood and endless grief. To many, he is both, embodying the contradictions of a nation caught between corruption, poverty, and the lure of the drug trade. It is this duality that makes his tale so hypnotic, so chilling, and so impossible to ignore. As we begin this journey tonight, let us move slowly, letting each detail sink in. The aim is not to sensationalize, but to understand. Close your eyes, if you wish, and picture the remote trails winding through the Jalisco countryside. Picture the mist rolling down the hills at dawn, the villages where farmers rise before the sun, the sound of roosters breaking the silence. Somewhere in this landscape, Nemesio was once a boy running barefoot along a dirt road, unaware of the destiny that waited for him. Somewhere here, the first seeds of ambition were planted, seeds that would grow into a tree so vast its shadow now stretches across continents. In the coming hours, we will trace his rise from those humble beginnings, through the dangerous early years in California when he first crossed paths with law enforcement, through his time as a foot soldier for older cartels, and into the bloody wars that birthed CJNG, the cartel he would one day lead with an iron grip. We will explore the battles that turned towns into battlefields, the alliances that lifted him to power, and the betrayals that hardened him into one of the most ruthless men alive. And when we reach the present, we will find him where he has always been, just out of reach, a figure who seems to live one step ahead of the world. For now, allow the night to settle around you. The crickets sing softly, the breeze whispers through the trees, and the mountains keep their secrets. Somewhere out there, the man they call El Mencho waits, perhaps unaware that his story is being told in this quiet moment. Or perhaps he knows, perhaps he always knows. As we begin, remember this: every empire has its dawn and its dusk, its rise and its fall. Tonight, we follow the rise. Tonight, we step into the shadows, not to fear them, but to understand the man who built his throne within them. The story of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes cannot be told without first returning to the quiet, sun-baked hills of Eguililla, Michoacán, where he was born. It is a place where the earth is dry and red, where the horizon stretches wide and endless, and where life, for most families, was measured by the success of the harvest. Eguililla was a small town, known more for its hard-working people than for any particular wealth or fame. The roads were dusty, the houses simple, and the rhythm of life slow. It was here, in this remote corner of Mexico, that Nemesio grew up surrounded by the daily struggle that came with poverty. His family, like many others, made their living from the land. They farmed, they tended livestock, they endured the heat of the summers and the cool nights of the winters. Nemesio was born in 1966 into a world that offered few opportunities for escape. Mexico in those years was marked by social inequality and limited prospects for rural youth. The government presence was light in towns like Eguililla, which meant that survival often depended not on the state but on the strength of family, community, and sometimes one's own cunning. In this environment, Nemesio learned early the value of resilience, of staying quiet and working hard, of enduring without complaint. He was one of several siblings, part of a large family that depended on every pair of hands to get through the season. The boy who would one day command one of the world's most powerful cartels began his life walking barefoot along dirt paths, carrying water, tending animals, and helping with the harvest. The mountains of Michoacán shaped him, not just physically but psychologically. They were both a barrier and a shield, separating the town from the outside world, and they taught him lessons in patience, in waiting for the right moment, in observing before acting. Those who knew him as a child remember him as quiet, serious, a boy who seemed to think before he spoke. Poverty leaves an imprint on the mind, and for Nemesio, it planted a hunger for something more. He would watch the older men in town who had managed to buy new trucks, who seemed to have more money than their neighbors, and he would wonder how they had done it. It was not a mystery for long. In regions like Michoacán, the drug trade was already weaving itself into the fabric of life. Marijuana and opium poppies grew in the hills, and some families, desperate for income, began cultivating them as a way to survive. Young Nemesio would have seen this world up close, men with money coming and going, rumors of danger, whispers of police raids. There is a saying in Mexico that poverty is the first teacher of ambition, and for Nemesio, that lesson was harsh and clear. He could remain a farmhand his whole life, or he could find another way. The other way, of course, came with risk, but it also came with the possibility of escaping the cycle of need that trapped so many of his peers. By his teenage years, Nemesio had developed a reputation for being disciplined and reliable. He was not reckless, he was not loud. He was the sort of young man who could be trusted to keep a secret, to follow instructions, to remain calm under pressure. These qualities would later serve him well in the underworld, but even in his youth, they set him apart. In those years, opportunities to make fast money were scarce, but word often spread when someone needed a courier or someone willing to take a small risk. Nemesio is believed to have started with small jobs, helping transport goods, earning money that he could bring back to his family. For a poor household, every peso counted, and his contributions would have made a difference. But money has a way of showing young men what is possible. With each job, he saw more clearly that there was a path beyond the fields, a path that could lead to trucks, land, respect. The contrast between the legitimate world of farming and the shadow world of trafficking must have fascinated him. The farmers worked from dawn to dusk, breaking their backs for meager earnings, while those involved in the trade seemed to move with a certain freedom, enjoying luxuries that others could only dream about. This was not simply greed at work, it was survival, ambition, and the desire to claim dignity in a world that offered so little. But Nemesio's story is not one of instant transformation. He did not leap from farm boy to cartel boss overnight. Instead, he took slow, careful steps, learning from each experience. This patient, deliberate approach would become one of his trademarks. He watched, he listened, and he waited for opportunities. By the time he reached adulthood, it was clear that staying in Eguililla forever was not an option. There was too little money, too little future. Like many young men of his generation, he set his sights northward toward the United States. The journey north was a leap into the unknown. Migrating to the U.S. was not uncommon for Mexicans from rural towns, especially in the 1980s, and Nemesio would have joined countless others who made the dangerous trip across the border in search of work. At first, his goals may have been simple: earn money, send it back home, support the family. But America exposed him to more than just jobs in the fields or kitchens. It exposed him to the networks, the markets, and the immense demand for narcotics. In California, where he first settled, the drug trade was already thriving, and for a man with Nemesio's quiet determination, it represented both opportunity and education. The boy from Eguililla was growing into a man with vision. Though still far from becoming the fearsome figure who would one day command armies of sicarios, these early experiences were shaping him, teaching him lessons that no school could offer. The poverty of Michoacan had given him hunger. The streets of California would soon teach him strategy. His childhood in Eguililla had prepared him to endure hardship. Now, the next stage of his life would prepare him to exploit it. Somewhere deep inside, Nemesio must have sensed that his path was already set. The world of crime was not just an option, it was becoming a calling. And yet, even now, he remained cautious, deliberate, careful not to draw too much attention. The boy from Michoacan was about to become something else entirely, but for now, he was still in transition, standing at the threshold of a life that would soon take him far beyond the dusty roads of his birthplace. By the time Nemesio Oseguera settled into life in California, the quiet boy from Eguililla had grown into a man with a sharper edge, a man who had tasted both the struggles of survival and the possibilities that lay beyond farm work. The United States in the 1980s was a place of opportunity, but it was also a place of temptation. The drug trade was booming, fueled by skyrocketing demand for heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine in cities across the country. It was an era when cartels in Mexico were building powerful supply chains, and small-time dealers were the crucial links that kept the market running. For a young man like Nemesio, whose early years had been spent watching his family scrape by, the lure of fast money was impossible to ignore. His first steps into crime were small, cautious, and carefully measured. He was not a reckless gangster looking for glory. He was methodical, observant, and deeply aware of the risks. Nemesio began working as a low-level distributor, moving small quantities of heroin on the streets of California. It was dangerous work, but it offered cash that was far greater than anything he could have earned in the fields or restaurants. He learned how to operate discreetly, how to watch for police, how to avoid drawing attention. In those early days, he was just one of many nameless figures in the drug trade, but even then, his discipline set him apart. The streets were a brutal teacher, and Nemesio learned quickly. Arrests were common for dealers, and before long, he too had his first encounter with American law enforcement. He was picked up for heroin distribution, one of several arrests that would mark his years in the United States. Each time he was caught, he faced the reality of jail, courtrooms, and eventually deportation back to Mexico. But rather than scaring him away from crime, these early arrests seemed to have sharpened his instincts. He studied the system, learned its weaknesses, and learned how to operate more carefully. Every mistake became a lesson, every setback an opportunity to adapt. It is said that prison hardens a man, but for Nemesio, the real transformation was psychological. He saw firsthand how easily others were caught because they were careless, they flaunted their earnings, they trusted the wrong people, they spoke too freely. Nemesio did none of these things. Even in his early criminal career, he was quiet, calculating, and careful about who he let into his circle. These were not just survival tactics, they were the foundations of the leadership style he would one day use to run one of the most feared cartels on earth. During his years in California, Nemesio was deported more than once, but he kept returning. Each time he crossed the border again, he came back with more experience, more knowledge, and more determination. These trips back and forth between Mexico and the United States exposed him to both worlds, the supply side in Mexico and the demand side in America. He understood, perhaps better than most, the enormous profits that could be made by those who controlled the flow of narcotics across the border. The experience was like an informal education in the business of trafficking, teaching him everything from pricing to logistics to distribution. Still, he remained at the lower levels of the operation. There were no grand escapes, no dramatic shootouts, not yet. This was a period of apprenticeship, a time when he was still learning the rules of the game. But Nemesio was patient. He was willing to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity to move up. That opportunity came slowly, as he began to build relationships with higher-level figures in the drug trade, men who recognized his loyalty and discipline. Trust was a rare commodity in that world, and Nemesio had the one quality that mattered most: he could be relied upon to get the job done. Those who worked with him in those years later said that he was not a man who bragged or drew attention to himself. He was the sort of man who preferred to stay in the background, observing, making mental notes, learning from others' mistakes. But beneath the quiet surface, there was an ambition burning. Nemesio had seen enough of poverty to know he never wanted to go back to it. He had seen enough of power to know he wanted more of it. The turning point came when Nemesio realized that simply working as a distributor would never be enough. If he wanted to change his life, he needed to climb higher. This meant returning to Mexico permanently and positioning himself where the real power lay, closer to the source, closer to the organizations that controlled production and transport. By the late 1980s, his repeated arrests and deportations made staying in the United States increasingly difficult. The authorities knew his name, they knew his face, and the risks of continuing in California were becoming too great. When Nemesio finally returned to Mexico for good, he was no longer just a farm boy from Iguililla. He was a man who had seen the inside of jails, who had learned how the trade worked on both sides of the border, and who had cultivated a mindset of patience and discipline. He understood the stakes, he understood the risks, and most importantly, he understood that in order to rise, he would need to surround himself with the right people, people who shared his vision, people who could be trusted when bullets started to fly. This period of his life was the crucible in which Nemesio Oseguera was forged. He had been tested by hardship, by poverty, by the constant threat of prison, and he had come out sharper, harder, and more determined than ever. The man who stepped back into Michoacán was not the same man who had left. He carried with him the lessons of the American streets, lessons that would become the building blocks of the empire he was about to create. And yet, at this stage, the world still did not know his name. He was just another man among thousands trying to make a living in the shifting landscape of Mexico's criminal underworld. But inside Nemesio, the plan was taking shape, the ambition was solidifying. The time for small-scale dealing was over. The next phase of his life would be about alliances, about learning from the established cartels, about proving himself as someone who could be more than just a foot soldier. What happened next would change his life forever. The return to Mexico would lead him into the orbit of the Cartel Milenio, one of the organizations that controlled trafficking routes in the west of the country. It was here that Nemesio would finally find the arena where his talents could shine. It was here that the boy from Iguililla would become the apprentice to men who ran multimillion-dollar operations, and it was here, quietly and patiently, that he would begin climbing the ladder toward power. The United States had been more than just a place for Nemesio Oseguera to earn quick money, it had been a classroom. Every street corner, every dealer, every brush with law enforcement taught him something new about how the narcotics trade worked from the ground up. While many young men who found themselves caught in the web of drug trafficking became reckless or desperate, Nemesio approached it differently. He treated it like a craft, one that could be mastered if only he observed carefully enough and played his role with precision. In California, Nemesio learned how the distribution chain functioned. He saw how the product moved from the supplier to the middleman, from the middleman to the street dealer, and from there to the hands of thousands of users scattered across cities. Each link in that chain represented risk, and each link also represented profit. He understood that the higher up you were in that chain, the more money you made, but also the more attention you drew. These lessons would stay with him for the rest of his life, shaping the way he later built the Jalisco New Generation Cartel into a vertically integrated organization that could control every step of the process, from production to distribution. He also learned about logistics, how shipments were hidden in trucks, how couriers were paid, how bribes kept certain doors open. He saw which methods worked and which ones failed. He paid attention to the mistakes others made, and he rarely made the same ones himself. Nemesio understood that in the drug trade, survival depended not just on courage or ruthlessness but on intelligence. One slip, one careless conversation, one unnecessary display of wealth could bring everything crashing down. But perhaps the most important lesson Nemesio learned in the United States was about demand. He saw firsthand how insatiable the market was, how no matter how many arrests the authorities made, there were always new buyers, always new dealers willing to take the risk. The money was too good, the pull too strong. This understanding gave him a kind of quiet confidence. As long as there was demand, there would be supply, and as long as there was supply, there would be a place for men like him, men willing to move the product no matter the danger. Yet life in the US was not without its challenges. Each arrest, each stint in jail, reminded him that the American justice system was unforgiving. He learned to stay calm in courtrooms, to answer carefully, to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. These encounters hardened him but also taught him the value of discretion. Unlike some of his peers who flaunted their earnings and courted danger, Nemesio kept a low profile. He dressed simply, avoided luxury displays, and preferred to blend in. This ability to stay invisible would one day become one of his greatest weapons, allowing him to lead one of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations while remaining one of the least photographed and most mysterious figures in organized crime. The back-and-forth deportations added to his education. Every time he was sent back to Mexico, he returned to the United States more determined, more careful, more aware of the dangers. These journeys across the border gave him insight into smuggling routes and into the challenges of crossing undetected. He saw where the U.S. border was strongest, where it was weakest, and how those weaknesses could be exploited. Later in life, when CJNG would move tons of narcotics across the border, these early observations would prove invaluable. Nemesio's time in the United States also exposed him to another kind of education, the business mindset of America. He saw how legitimate companies operated, how they used structure, planning, and delegation to maximize efficiency. While his business was illegal, the principles of organization were the same. He learned that chaos was expensive, that discipline and order were necessary if you wanted to build something that lasted. These were lessons he would take back with him when he finally returned to Mexico to stay. One can imagine Nemesio in those years as a man quietly absorbing everything around him. He was not seeking notoriety or thrills, he was building a mental blueprint. Every deal, every risk, every arrest was a data point, a piece of a puzzle that would one day form a much larger picture. This was not just survival, this was preparation. By the late 1980s it became clear that the United States could no longer be his permanent base of operations. The authorities knew him, and the risk of longer prison sentences was rising. But Nemesio was leaving with something far more valuable than money. He was leaving with knowledge, with connections, with a deep understanding of how the entire narcotics ecosystem worked from top to bottom. When he crossed back into Mexico for the last time, he was no longer just another deportee, he was a man with a plan. That plan would soon take him into the heart of the Mexican drug trade. He would align himself with cartels that were already controlling key routes, learn from their leaders, and slowly rise through their ranks. His American years had given him the tools, now Mexico would give him the platform to use them. Somewhere along the way, Nemesio must have realized that he was no longer content to be a small player. He had seen too much, learned too much, to settle for anything less than power. And so, with the patience that had always defined him, he began to prepare for the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would bring him closer to the heart of the cartel world, and closer to the violence that would eventually define his name. The boy from Eguililla had completed his education. The streets of California had been his university, the arrests his exams, the deportations his final lessons. Now, armed with everything he had learned, Nemesio Oseguera was ready to begin the long climb toward becoming El Mencho. When Nemesio Oseguera finally returned to Mexico for good, he was a man transformed. The boy who had once run barefoot through the dirt roads of Eguililla was gone, replaced by someone sharper, someone who had learned to see the world not just as it was but as it could be shaped. He had spent years in the United States, moving product, surviving arrests, learning the delicate balance between risk and reward. Now, he came back with a purpose, to find a place in the machinery of the Mexican drug trade and to climb as high as that machinery would take him. Life in Mexico was changing quickly. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a period of flux in the underworld. The old guard cartels were beginning to fracture, and new players were emerging. For Nemesio, this was opportunity disguised as danger. The criminal landscape was dangerous and unstable, but it was also more open than it had been in decades. Those with discipline, patience, and the ability to organize could carve out space for themselves. Nemesio did not return to Mexico with fanfare or with an entourage. True to form, he kept a low profile. He reconnected with his family in Eguililla, blending back into the rhythms of rural life, but he was already looking for his next step. He knew that if he wanted to rise, he would need to attach himself to an organization with the resources, connections, and muscle to compete. That search eventually brought him into the orbit of the Milenio Cartel, also known as the Valencia Cartel. The Milenio Cartel controlled significant trafficking routes in western Mexico. They moved large quantities of methamphetamine, marijuana, and cocaine, operating quietly but efficiently, with a network that stretched from Jalisco and Michoacán to the border with the United States. For a man like Nemesio, aligning with Milenio was like stepping into the big leagues. He started small, as he always did, taking on minor roles, proving himself through loyalty and competence. Those early years in Milenio were like another apprenticeship, but this time Nemesio was learning at a much higher level. He was no longer just a street dealer. He was involved in the logistics of moving tonnage, in coordinating routes, in managing risk at a scale he had never seen before. This was where his discipline truly stood out. Unlike some cartel operatives who became intoxicated by power and money, Nemesio remained focused. He avoided unnecessary violence, avoided drawing attention, and built a reputation as someone who could be trusted to handle delicate operations. Violence, when it came, was always calculated. Milenio operated in a world where threats were constant rival groups, corrupt officials, and even betrayals within their own ranks could destabilize everything. Nemesio showed that he was willing to do what was necessary, but he also showed that he would not act recklessly. This balance of ruthlessness and restraint made him stand out to his superiors. During this period, Nemesio also deepened his personal ties to the Valencia family, marrying Rosalinda González Valencia, the sister of key Milenio figures. This marriage not only tied him to one of the most influential families in the cartel but also gave him a degree of protection and legitimacy within the organization. Through Rosalinda, Nemesio became more than just a trusted lieutenant, he became part of the inner circle. His work for the Milenio Cartel allowed him to see firsthand the weaknesses of the organization as well as its strengths. He learned which routes were most profitable, which lieutenants were reliable, which ones could be bought, and which ones were liabilities. He paid attention to how leadership decisions were made and how conflicts were resolved. In the process, he was building a mental map of how a cartel could be run more efficiently, a vision that would one day shape CJNG into a disciplined, almost militaristic organization. But this was not a peaceful era. Mexico in the 1990s was a battleground, with cartels fighting for territory and the government occasionally intervening in ways that destabilized the balance of power. Nemesio survived shootouts, raids, and internal power struggles, each one sharpening him further. He learned that survival depended on more than firepower, it depended on timing, alliances, and a keen ability to read the shifting winds of cartel politics. Even in these years, Nemesio's personality remained elusive. He was not a flamboyant figure like some cartel leaders who craved public attention. There were no gold-plated guns, no gaudy parties, no headlines boasting of his exploits. He preferred to move in the background, letting others take the spotlight while he focused on consolidating his position. This invisibility became his shield, allowing him to move pieces on the board without attracting the kind of scrutiny that could bring everything down. By the late 1990s, Nemesio had climbed significantly within the Milenio ranks. He was no longer just another operative, he was a trusted figure with influence and growing power. Yet even then, he understood that Milenio had vulnerabilities. The cartel was strong, but it was also susceptible to external pressure from law enforcement and rivals. Nemesio could see cracks forming, and he began preparing for the possibility that one day, Milenio might fall. This period of quiet preparation is one of the most fascinating aspects of Nemesio's rise. He did not rush. He did not attempt a coup or openly challenge the leadership. Instead, he focused on building loyalty among his own men, recruiting people who would answer to him personally, and creating a network that could survive even if Milenio collapsed. It was a patient strategy, the work of a man who understood that power was not just taken, it was built, step by step, until the moment was right. When Nemesio looked out at the horizon from his home in Jalisco or Michoacán, he must have known that bigger storms were coming. The Mexican drug war was heating up, and with it would come opportunities and dangers on a scale the country had never seen. For now, though, he remained the disciplined lieutenant, the quiet strategist, the man who kept his head down and his eyes open. The day would come when Nemesio would step out of the shadows and claim leadership of his own organization. The day would come when he would no longer serve another cartel but create his own. But that day was still in the future. For now, Nemesio Oseguera was exactly where he wanted to be, learning, preparing, and waiting. The years that Nemesio spent with the Milenio cartel were not just formative, they were transformational. By the turn of the millennium, he was no longer the quiet farm boy from Aguililla, nor merely the small-time heroin dealer who had once walked the streets of California. He had become something else, a trusted figure within one of Western Mexico's most significant drug trafficking networks, a man known for discipline, precision, and the ability to keep operations running smoothly even when chaos threatened to derail everything. The Milenio cartel was, in many ways, a proving ground for Nemesio. It was an organization that demanded loyalty but also rewarded competence. It gave him a glimpse into the inner workings of high-level cartel operations, not just the moving of product, but the politics, the alliances, and the decision-making that kept a criminal empire alive. Nemesio was no mere soldier at this point. He was an apprentice learning from some of the most experienced traffickers in Mexico. He watched how the leadership handled everything from logistics to disputes. He observed how alliances were forged with other cartels, how bribes were distributed to keep law enforcement at bay, how violence was deployed strategically to send a message or reclaim lost ground. And as he observed, he began to form his own ideas about how a cartel should be run. Nemesio admired the Milenio cartel's efficiency, but he also noticed its weaknesses, its over-reliance on certain leaders, its occasional lapses in discipline, and its vulnerability when arrests took down key figures. During these years, Nemesio also took on more active roles in enforcement. The Milenio cartel had enemies, rivals, who wanted to take over their territories, opportunistic gangs that preyed on their shipments, and even former allies who turned against them. Nemesio proved himself capable not just as a logistics man but as someone who could handle violent situations with cold efficiency. He was not impulsive, but when force was required, he acted decisively. His men came to respect him not only for his ability to plan but for his willingness to stand with them when bullets started flying. Slowly, he began to build a loyal cadre of operatives, men who would follow him because they trusted him, because he looked out for them, and because he treated the work like a disciplined profession rather than a chaotic scramble for quick riches. This loyalty would later become the backbone of the organization he would create, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The 2000s were a turbulent time for cartels across Mexico. The government was stepping up efforts to dismantle organized crime, and the arrest or killing of key leaders often sent shockwaves through entire organizations. The Milenio cartel was not immune. A series of arrests began to destabilize its hierarchy, and rival groups sensed weakness. For Nemesio, this was both a dangerous and opportune moment. He had prepared for this. Over the years, he had cultivated relationships not just within Milenio but outside it, with corrupt officials, with other traffickers, with suppliers. When cracks began to appear in the cartel's leadership, Nemesio positioned himself as a stabilizing force, someone who could keep operations running even as others were captured or killed. This quiet competence elevated his status even further. But it also put him closer to the inevitable internal conflicts that arise when an organization is under pressure. The Milenio cartel began to splinter into factions, each vying for control. What had once been a unified organization was now fractured, its leaders fighting among themselves. Nemesio, true to his nature, did not act rashly. He continued to focus on building strength quietly, gathering loyal men, and preparing for what he must have known was coming, a full-scale rupture that would change the criminal landscape of Jalisco forever. During this time, Nemesio's marriage to Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia proved to be both a personal bond and a strategic alliance. The Gonzalez Valencia family was powerful, deeply embedded in the Milenio cartel's operations. Through Rosalinda, Nemesio had a seat at the table, access to information, and a platform from which to influence decisions. The trust he had earned and the family ties he had secured made him nearly untouchable within the cartel's inner circle. Yet even as he gained influence, Nemesio remained elusive. Unlike other rising figures who flaunted their power, he kept to the shadows, letting others draw the spotlight. This invisibility was not just instinctive, it was strategic. He had seen what happened to leaders who became too public, too visible. They were the first to fall when law enforcement came knocking. Nemesio chose the opposite path, staying quiet, staying hidden, and letting his reputation grow through whispers rather than headlines. By the late 2000s it was clear to everyone around him that Nemesio Oseguera was no longer just an apprentice. He was a power in his own right. He had men who would take his orders without question, he had routes under his control, and he had a vision for something greater than Mencho. All he needed was the right moment to break away. And that moment was approaching fast. The capture of key Mencho leaders sent the organization into disarray. Factions turned on one another, and what had once been a strong, centralized cartel began to collapse under the weight of internal conflict. For most men, this would have been a moment of crisis. For Nemesio, it was the opportunity he had been patiently waiting for. He did not rush into the power vacuum recklessly. Instead, he consolidated his loyalists, secured territory, and made sure that when he acted, he would not just be seizing control temporarily, he would be laying the foundation for a new organization, one that would be stronger, more disciplined, and more resilient than anything Mencho had ever been. The final years of his time within Mencho were marked by both blood and strategy. Battles were fought, men were lost, but Nemesio emerged from the chaos stronger than before. When the dust finally settled, he and his faction were no longer merely a part of the Mencho cartel, they were something new, something formidable, something that would soon terrify their rivals and capture the attention of the world. The apprentice had become the master. The man who had once stood quietly in the background was now ready to step forward to shape the destiny of an entire organization and to transform it into what would become the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The storm was gathering, and Nemesio Oseguera was about to step into its center. The split that would give birth to the Jalisco New Generation Cartel was not a single moment but a series of events, each one more violent and consequential than the last. By the late 2000s, the Mencho cartel was unraveling. Years of arrests, extraditions, and killings had stripped the organization of its top leadership. The once organized structure had begun to splinter into rival factions, each loyal to a different surviving commander, each vying for control over the lucrative trafficking routes in Jalisco and Michoacán. The delicate balance that had kept the cartel functioning was gone, replaced by chaos, betrayal, and blood. For Nemesio Oseguera, this was the moment he had anticipated. He had spent years patiently building a loyal base of operatives, men who trusted him, men who had seen him make calm, measured decisions under pressure. Now those men would become the foundation of something new. But Nemesio was not impulsive. He did not simply declare independence overnight. Instead, he waited for the perfect moment, the moment when Mencho's internal conflicts would weaken it enough for him to make his move without inviting immediate destruction. That moment came in 2010, when Oscar Orlando Nava Valencia, one of Mencho's last powerful leaders, was captured by Mexican authorities. His arrest left a vacuum at the top, and the cartel fractured into warring factions. One faction aligned with the Sinaloa cartel, seeking protection from Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's powerful federation. Another faction resisted Sinaloa's influence, determined to stay independent. Nemesio and his loyalists fell into the latter camp. He was unwilling to serve as a subordinate to Sinaloa's capos. He had learned too much, waited too long, to simply hand over his territory and autonomy. The conflict quickly escalated into open warfare. What had been internal disputes turned into pitched battles across Jalisco. Convoys of armed men clashed on highways, safe houses were raided, and bodies began appearing in public places as each side tried to assert dominance. For the people of Jalisco, it was as if a shadow war had erupted overnight, turning once quiet towns into battlegrounds. Nemesio's faction proved to be more disciplined and better organized than many expected. He brought a level of military precision to the fight, coordinating attacks, securing key routes, and striking at rivals with ruthless efficiency. His men were known for their professionalism and for the terrifying messages they left behind, banners and notes warning enemies that CJNG had arrived and that resistance would be met with death. It was during this war that the name Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generation, or CJNG, first began to circulate. At first, it was whispered among rivals, then reported in the news. The name itself was a statement, a declaration that a new force had been born in the world of organized crime, one that would not just replace Milenio but surpass it. CJNG's emergence was marked by acts of both violence and theater. Nemesio understood the power of fear, and he used it to his advantage. Bodies were sometimes hung from bridges, narcomentas, large banners with written messages were displayed in public, and videos began to appear online showing CJNG gunmen in military-style formation, armed with assault rifles and wearing tactical gear. These displays were not just intimidation, they were propaganda, carefully crafted to project strength and inevitability. But CJNG was not just about violence, it was about discipline and structure. Nemesio insisted on maintaining order within his ranks. Unlike some cartels where lieutenants acted independently and recklessly, CJNG operated under a clear hierarchy. Orders flowed from the top down, and disobedience was not tolerated. This structure made the organization more resilient, more capable of carrying out coordinated actions even under pressure. The war against rival factions was brutal, but Nemesio emerged from it as the undisputed leader of a powerful new cartel. By 2011, CJNG had secured control over key territories in Jalisco and Michoacán. They moved quickly to consolidate their power, eliminating remaining rivals and establishing themselves as the dominant force in the region. Their operations extended beyond drug trafficking. They engaged in extortion, kidnapping, fuel theft, and money laundering, creating a diversified criminal enterprise that could withstand pressure from law enforcement and competition alike. The rise of CJNG was meteoric, and it sent shockwaves through Mexico's underworld. Other cartels took notice, as did the government. Law enforcement began to treat CJNG as one of the most dangerous emerging threats in the country. The media dubbed them Mata Zetas, or Zeta killers, after CJNG released a video claiming responsibility for killing dozens of members of Los Zetas, one of Mexico's most feared cartels at the time. Whether the claim was fully true or partly propaganda, it cemented CJNG's reputation as a force capable of taking on even the most ruthless of rivals. For Nemesio, these early victories were proof that his patience and planning had paid off. He had waited for the right moment, built his network carefully, and struck with precision. Now he stood at the head of an organization that was growing stronger by the day. But with power came new challenges. Every victory brought more attention, from rivals who wanted to destroy CJNG before it grew too strong, and from authorities who now recognized Nemesio as a major player in the drug war. Despite the growing spotlight, Nemesio continued to maintain his low profile. While his cartel's name was becoming infamous, very few people had seen his face. There were almost no recent photographs of him, no public appearances, no interviews. To the public, he remained a ghostly figure, a name whispered with fear but rarely seen. This invisibility became part of his myth, and it allowed him to lead from the shadows even as his organization waged open war across the country. The birth of CJNG was not just the birth of a cartel, it was the birth of a new era in Mexican organized crime. Nemesio had proven that a disciplined, well-organized group could rise from the ashes of a collapsing cartel and become stronger than what came before. He had shown that careful planning, patience, and ruthless efficiency could outmatch sheer brutality or reckless ambition. And he had set the stage for what would become one of the bloodiest and most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico's history. As the dust settled on the initial battles, Nemesio and his men stood victorious, but the war was far from over. The enemies they had made would not forget, and the government would soon escalate its pursuit. Yet for the moment, Nemesio had what he had always wanted: control, territory, and an organization that answered to him and him alone. The apprentice had not only broken away from his old masters, he had built something entirely his own. The smoke of the millennial split had barely cleared when Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes emerged as the undisputed head of a new force that would soon dominate the underworld, the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generation. For years, he had operated in the shadows, building trust, building networks, preparing for the day when he would no longer be a subordinate. Now, that day had come. Nemesio, known to his men and rivals as El Mencho, stood at the helm of a cartel that was young, hungry, and determined to expand. What happened next would define not just his life but the balance of power in Mexico's criminal world for the next decade. The first priority for Nemesio was consolidation. CJNG had emerged from a war, but its survival was not yet guaranteed. Rival factions still lingered, government forces were watching closely, and former allies who had chosen the Sinaloa side were waiting for their chance to strike. Nemesio moved quickly to stabilize his organization. He reorganized his command structure, placing trusted lieutenants in charge of key territories and ensuring that everyone understood the chain of command. Orders flowed downward with military precision, and disobedience was dealt with swiftly. CJNG's internal discipline became one of its defining characteristics. While other cartels sometimes descended into chaos when leaders were captured or killed, Nemesio insisted on a system that could survive without him if necessary. He knew that the government would eventually come for him, so he built an organization that would not collapse at the first strike. This was one of the reasons CJNG grew so quickly. Its operations remained stable even under pressure, allowing it to continue expanding while rivals faltered. Territory was everything, and Nemesio understood that the key to power was controlling strategic routes. CJNG began to move aggressively, pushing into neighboring states, seizing plazas, and driving out competitors. In Michoacán, they clashed with the Knights Templar cartel, engaging in brutal firefights that turned towns into war zones. In Veracruz, they challenged Los Zetas, one of the most feared cartels in Mexico, leaving bodies and banners as a warning that CJNG was there to stay. But expansion was not just about violence, it was also about winning hearts and minds. Nemesio understood that to hold territory, CJNG would need the support, or at least the cooperation, of local populations. In some areas, the cartel provided food, medicine, and even infrastructure. They painted themselves as protectors of the people, defenders against rival groups who were seen as more predatory. This dual approach, terror for enemies, patronage for locals, helped CJNG entrench itself deeply in the regions it controlled. At the same time, CJNG began to professionalize its armed wing. Mencho invested heavily in weapons, vehicles, and training, turning his gunmen into something that looked less like a street gang and more like a paramilitary force. Videos circulated online showing CJNG convoys with armored trucks, belt-fed machine guns, and men in matching uniforms moving in formation. These displays were carefully staged, designed to project an image of unstoppable power. They also served as a message to rivals and authorities alike. CJNG was not just another cartel, it was a modern, disciplined army. Behind the scenes, Nemesio was also streamlining the cartel's financial operations. Money laundering networks were strengthened, legitimate businesses were acquired, and sophisticated methods were developed to hide profits. CJNG was no longer just a trafficking group, it was becoming a multinational enterprise. Methamphetamine production was ramped up, with superlabs capable of producing tons of product each month. Connections with chemical suppliers in Asia ensured a steady flow of precursors, while distribution routes into the United States and Europe were secured. For Nemesio personally, this was a period of immense growth but also of increasing caution. He knew that as CJNG's power grew, so would the pressure from the government and international agencies. The DEA had already begun to take notice of the new cartel boss who seemed to be expanding faster than anyone thought possible. To protect himself, Nemesio withdrew further from public view. He rarely appeared in populated areas, preferring remote safe houses in the mountains. He communicated with his lieutenants through trusted intermediaries, avoiding phones and anything that could be traced. Those who have studied his leadership say that Nemesio's style was a mixture of pragmatism and iron control. He rewarded loyalty generously but punished betrayal without hesitation. He expected discipline from his men and reportedly kept close watch over even his top commanders to ensure they were not skimming profits or making unauthorized moves. This tight control created a culture of fear but also of efficiency. Everyone knew the rules and everyone knew the consequences of breaking them. CJNG's rise during these years was so rapid that it shocked even seasoned observers of the drug war. Within a few short years, they had gone from a regional faction to a national powerhouse, controlling large swaths of territory and challenging the supremacy of older, more established cartels. In some areas, CJNG's expansion was so complete that they effectively became the local government, dictating who could operate businesses, who could transport goods, and even who could live in certain towns. Despite this explosive growth, Nemesio's personal myth only deepened. There were few, if any, confirmed sightings of him. His enemies rarely knew his exact location, and even his allies often received orders through layers of communication rather than direct meetings. To many, he seemed like a ghost who directed one of the most violent forces in Mexico without ever being seen. This invisibility became one of his greatest weapons, making it nearly impossible for authorities to capture him. The consolidation of CJNG under Nemesio's rule marked a turning point in Mexico's criminal history. A new power had risen, one that was not just violent but organized, not just ruthless but strategic. For Nemesio, it was the realization of years of planning and patience. He had survived the farm fields of Igualila, the streets of California, the wars of Milenio, and now he stood as the supreme leader of a cartel that was poised to change the balance of power across Mexico. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Nemesio must have known that the road ahead would be dangerous. Every step upward drew more attention, more enemies, more pressure. The government would not ignore him, and rival cartels would not forgive him. But Nemesio had built CJNG to withstand storms, and he was ready for whatever came next. The rise of El Mencho was complete. The quiet apprentice had become a general, commanding armies of men, controlling territories worth billions and shaping the future of Mexico's drug war. And yet, the story was far from over. The battles ahead would be even bloodier, the stakes even higher, and the legend of El Mencho would only grow darker as CJNG continued its relentless march toward dominance. When CJNG had consolidated its hold on Jalisco, the next phase of its rise began, and it was written in blood. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, now known universally as El Mencho, understood that survival was not enough. To truly dominate, CJNG would need to expand beyond its home state, and that meant going to war. The Mexican underworld is not a static place. Every plaza, every trafficking route, every port is contested territory. Rivals were waiting just beyond Jalisco's borders, watching CJNG's meteoric rise with a mixture of fear and hatred. They knew that if Nemesio's cartel continued to grow unchecked, it would soon threaten their own power. The first major clashes came with the Knights Templar cartel in neighboring Michoacán. The Knights Templar were a brutal organization, notorious for their iron-fisted control of towns, their extortion rackets, and their cult-like ideology that mixed crime with religious symbolism. They were entrenched in Michoacán, and they had no intention of letting CJNG take their territory. What followed was a campaign of violence that turned the state into a war zone. Convoys of armed CJNG sicarios rolled into contested towns in the dead of night, engaging in firefights with Knights Templar gunmen. Entire villages found themselves caught in the crossfire. The sounds of automatic weapons echoed through the hills, and the morning light often revealed the aftermath: burned-out trucks, bullet-riddled homes, and bodies lying on the roadside. These clashes were not quick skirmishes, but drawn-out battles for control, fought street by street, ranch by ranch. El Mencho's strategy was brutal but effective. He used overwhelming force to push the Knights Templar back, combining superior firepower with psychological warfare. When CJNG took a town, they made sure everyone knew it. Banners were hung declaring their presence, and messages were left warning that cooperation with rivals would be met with death. At the same time, CJNG would sometimes deliver food or aid to the local population, presenting themselves as liberators rather than conquerors. This dual approach, fear and patronage, eroded the Knights Templars' grip on communities and slowly shifted the balance of power. But Michoacán was only one front. CJNG also set its sights on Veracruz, a state controlled in large part by Los Zetas, one of the most feared cartels in Mexico. Los Zetas were known for their extreme violence, decapitations, mass killings, public displays of terror. To challenge them was to declare war on one of the most dangerous organizations in the country. Nemesio did not hesitate. CJNG struck hard, launching a campaign that would make its name known nationwide. They called themselves Mata Zetas, or Zeta Killers, and claimed responsibility for killing dozens of Zetas in a single sweep. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in 2011, when 35 bodies were dumped on a busy road in Veracruz, a chilling demonstration of CJNG's reach and willingness to escalate the conflict. The message was clear: CJNG was not afraid of Los Zetas, and they intended to wipe them out wherever they found them. These actions shocked Mexico. The sheer scale of the killings, combined with the public nature of the display, showed that CJNG was unlike most other cartels. They were not just fighting quietly in the shadows, they were announcing their presence, using spectacle as a weapon. Videos began to circulate online showing CJNG gunmen in full tactical gear, lined up in formation, pledging loyalty to El Mencho and vowing to destroy Los Zetas. These videos were propaganda, but they were also a show of force, a warning to rivals and the government that CJNG was a cartel with military discipline and ambition. The wars of these years were not limited to rival cartels. CJNG also clashed with law enforcement, staging ambushes on police convoys and even military units. In some cases, entire patrols were wiped out in carefully planned attacks. In 2015, CJNG fighters shot down a Mexican army helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade, an unprecedented escalation that stunned authorities and marked CJNG as one of the most dangerous threats the state had ever faced. For Nemesio, these wars served multiple purposes. They eliminated rivals, secured key routes, and solidified CJNG's reputation as a force to be feared. They also kept his men sharp and loyal. In a world where betrayal was common, shared victories and shared bloodshed forged bonds that could not easily be broken. His soldiers were not just employees, they were part of a brotherhood, bound together by the wars they fought under his command. But the cost of these conflicts was immense. Entire regions were destabilized. Civilians were displaced, businesses closed, and communities lived in constant fear. Nighttime became the most dangerous time, when convoys would move, when attacks would come. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, as though everyone knew that another battle could break out at any moment. Through it all, El Mencho remained invisible. His name was on everyone's lips, but his face was rarely seen. Intelligence reports suggested he moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few days. He traveled with a tight security ring, always alert for ambushes, always ready to vanish into the mountains if necessary. He had become a phantom general, directing one of the deadliest campaigns in the country from the safety of the shadows. CJNG's success in these wars elevated it from a regional player to a national power. They now controlled vast territories, including strategic ports like Manzanillo, crucial for importing chemical precursors needed to produce methamphetamine. Their rivals were either destroyed, pushed back, or forced into uneasy truces. The government now listed CJNG as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico, on par with or even surpassing the Sinaloa cartel in certain areas. For the people living in CJNG-controlled regions, life became a mixture of dread and grim acceptance. They knew who was in charge, and they knew better than to defy them. Yet some also acknowledged that CJNG kept order where none existed before, punishing petty criminals and, in some cases, preventing kidnappings or robberies by outsiders. In this way, Nemesio's cartel began to play the role of both destroyer and protector, a paradox that deepened his myth and complicated his legacy. By the end of these bloody campaigns, CJNG had not only survived but thrived. Their enemies had been weakened, their territory had expanded, and their reputation had been carved into the national consciousness with fire and steel. The wars had forged CJNG into an organization unlike any other, disciplined, feared, and loyal to a man who had turned from apprentice to kingmaker. The rise of El Mencho was no longer a quiet story whispered in back rooms. It was front-page news, a topic of international concern, a case file on every major law enforcement desk from Mexico City to Washington, D.C. The battles had been won, but Nemesio knew the war was far from over. The next challenge would not just come from rivals, but from governments determined to bring him down. By the time the dust began to settle on CJNG's bloody territorial wars, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes had accomplished something extraordinary. His cartel no longer simply controlled land, it controlled opportunity. With rivals weakened or eliminated, CJNG now possessed access to key smuggling routes, coastal ports, and hidden laboratories in the hills of Jalisco and Michoacán. For El Mencho, this was the perfect moment to take CJNG from a powerful regional cartel to a global criminal enterprise. The weapon that would make that possible was methamphetamine. Meth was not a new drug in Mexico, but CJNG turned its production into something almost industrial. Rather than relying on small clandestine kitchens, Nemesio's organization began building what authorities would later call superlabs, massive facilities capable of producing tons of crystal meth at a time. Hidden deep in rural areas, often protected by layers of security, these labs represented a leap in scale. Where once meth was cooked in small batches, CJNG could now flood entire markets with high-quality product. The cartel's control of the Pacific ports gave them a critical advantage. Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas became lifelines for importing precursor chemicals from Asia, especially from China, where many of the key substances used in meth production were manufactured legally. Shipping containers carrying tons of seemingly legitimate goods would arrive at the ports, and within them, hidden away, were the ingredients CJNG needed. From there, the chemicals were transported by truck to remote laboratories, where teams of trained chemists transformed them into methamphetamine. This level of organization required not just muscle, but business acumen, and Nemesio provided both. He oversaw the operation like a CEO managing a multinational company, making sure that supply never ran dry and that production remained uninterrupted. He invested in security, paying off port officials, police commanders, and local politicians to ensure that shipments could pass uninspected. This network of corruption was as important as any weapon, allowing CJNG to operate in plain sight without constant interference. Distribution was just as sophisticated. Once the meth was produced, it was packaged and moved north toward the United States, hidden in everything from produce shipments to commercial freight. Some loads were smuggled through established border crossings, concealed in vehicles that appeared legitimate. Others were sent through remote, unmanned sections of the border using off-road convoys or even drones. CJNG also built distribution networks within the U.S. using trusted associates to handle sales in cities across the country. The profits from methamphetamine were staggering. Tone for tone, meth was more profitable than many other drugs, and unlike heroin or cocaine, it did not depend on vulnerable crops that could be eradicated. As long as the chemicals could be imported, production could continue indefinitely. This gave CJNG a reliable, scalable product that could sustain its rapid growth. But CJNG was not content to stop with meth. Under Nemesio's leadership, they expanded into other drugs, including fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that was far more potent and far more deadly than heroin. Fentanyl production required many of the same precursors and lab setups as meth, so the transition was seamless. Soon, CJNG was not only one of the biggest producers of meth but also a major supplier of fentanyl to the U.S. market, contributing to the deadly opioid crisis that claimed tens of thousands of lives each year. This expansion turned CJNG into a true global player. Their products were no longer just moving into the United States, they were being shipped to Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Seizures in Australia and Spain bore the CJNG signature, proof that El Mencho's reach now extended far beyond Mexico's borders. The cartel had evolved from a regional force into a transnational powerhouse with operations on multiple continents. Yet for all this growth, Nemesio continued to maintain his ghostly profile. He rarely communicated directly, using couriers and coded messages to relay instructions. He kept moving, never sleeping in the same place twice, and often retreating to the mountains where helicopters and drones struggled to find him. His ability to stay hidden while running a global operation became one of the great mysteries of the drug war. The scale of CJNG's meth empire began to attract significant attention from international law enforcement. The DEA placed Nemesio on its most wanted list and offered a multimillion-dollar reward for information leading to his capture. In Washington, D.C., CJNG was designated a top transnational criminal organization, placing it on par with the world's most notorious mafia groups. This was both a badge of fearsome success and a warning sign. The full weight of international law enforcement was now focused on taking El Mencho down. For Nemesio, this meant operating with even greater caution. He doubled his security, restricted access to his inner circle, and increased the use of counterintelligence measures. Reports suggest that he employed teams specifically tasked with monitoring military and police movements in areas where he might be staying, giving him advance warning of raids. His organization even used armored vehicles and heavy weapons to repel government forces when necessary, turning some encounters into pitched battles. Despite the growing pressure, CJNG's global business continued to thrive. The steady flow of meth and fentanyl kept billions of dollars rolling in each year, money that was reinvested into more production, more bribes, and more weapons. This cycle of profit and power made CJNG nearly self-sustaining, allowing it to survive even when shipments were seized or lieutenants were arrested. The transformation of CJNG into a meth empire was perhaps Nemesio's greatest achievement as a strategist. He had taken a cartel born in blood and forged it into a multinational corporation of crime, one that combined ruthless enforcement with business sophistication. The meth trade was not just a source of wealth, it was the engine that powered CJNG's rise to the top of Mexico's criminal hierarchy. But this success came at a cost. The more powerful CJNG became, the more dangerous the game grew. Rivals who had once been defeated were regrouping, looking for ways to strike back. The Mexican government was deploying more resources to hunt him, and the United States was increasing pressure on Mexico to bring him to justice. Nemesio's empire was vast, but it was also vulnerable. One wrong move, one betrayal, could unravel everything he had built. And so, as CJNG's shipments crossed oceans and its meth reached users on distant continents, El Mencho remained in the shadows, always moving, always watching, always waiting. The global reach of his cartel was undeniable, but so too was the storm gathering on the horizon. By the mid-2010s, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was no longer just another cartel boss. He was the leader of one of the fastest-growing criminal organizations in the world, the man who had turned CJNG into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise stretching from the mountains of Jalisco to the streets of Los Angeles, Chicago, and Madrid. His name, whispered for years in fear, now appeared on the desks of officials in Washington, D.C. and in the offices of Interpol. El Mencho had become more than a regional problem, he was a global priority. For law enforcement, the challenge was unlike anything they had faced before. They were not dealing with a flamboyant kingpin who craved publicity and flaunted his wealth like Pablo Escobar or Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. They were dealing with a ghost. Nemesio had learned from the mistakes of others. He did not grant interviews, he did not appear in public, and photographs of him were scarce. Authorities sometimes went years without reliable sightings, relying on intercepted communications, informants, and fragments of intelligence to track his movements. Still, the pressure began to mount. In 2015, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed indictments against Nemesio, accusing him of leading an international drug trafficking conspiracy responsible for shipping tons of methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl into the United States. Around the same time, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, placed him on its most wanted list, offering a reward that eventually grew to $10 million for information leading to his capture. The message was clear: El Mencho was now one of the most sought-after fugitives in the world, on the same level as El Chapo before his capture. The manhunt became a joint effort between Mexican and U.S. authorities. Mexican Marines, considered the country's most elite fighting force, were deployed to raid suspected safe houses. Helicopters swept over the mountains of Jalisco, Michoacán, and Colima. Armored convoys rolled into rural towns as troops searched house to house. But each time they thought they were close, Nemesio slipped away. Part of his survival came down to geography. The mountainous terrain of Jalisco was a perfect hiding place. Dense forests, winding roads, and remote villages made it difficult for authorities to operate without being detected. CJNG controlled many of these areas, meaning locals often acted as lookouts, warning the cartel of approaching soldiers. By the time troops arrived, El Mencho was gone, sometimes only hours ahead of them, leaving behind traces but never himself. He also relied on a network of security that operated with military precision. According to intelligence reports, El Mencho traveled with heavily armed bodyguards who rotated regularly to avoid infiltration. He kept his circle extremely small, limiting contact to only the most trusted family members and lieutenants. Communication was conducted through coded messages and face-to-face meetings, reducing the risk of electronic surveillance. Despite these precautions, authorities came close several times. In 2015, during an operation in Jalisco, the Mexican government launched a massive raid aimed at capturing him. The response from CJNG was immediate and ferocious. Gunmen ambushed security forces, blocked roads with burning vehicles, and in a stunning display of firepower, shot down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade, killing several soldiers. It was one of the most dramatic escalations in the Mexican drug war, proving just how far CJNG was willing to go to protect its leader. This incident only intensified the hunt. For the Mexican government, capturing El Mencho became a matter of national pride. For the DEA, it was about dismantling a cartel that had become the single largest supplier of methamphetamine to the U.S. market. Task forces were formed, informants were cultivated, and intelligence sharing between the two countries reached new levels. But Nemesio remained elusive, vanishing each time they closed in. Part of the difficulty lay in his almost monastic lifestyle. Unlike other cartel leaders who lived lavishly, Nemesio was said to live simply, eating modest meals, avoiding alcohol, and maintaining strict discipline. He moved constantly, sleeping in remote safe houses or even camping in the wilderness when necessary. This Spartan existence made it harder for authorities to track him. There were no extravagant parties to crash, no flashy purchases to trace, no careless associates who might give him away. Even his family became targets of law enforcement efforts. His wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, was arrested in 2018 on charges of money laundering, accused of managing CJNG's finances through a network of front companies. His son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, was captured and extradited to the United States, where he faced charges of drug trafficking. These arrests were intended not just to disrupt CJNG's operations, but to pressure Nemesio personally, to weaken his resolve and draw him out of hiding. Yet if the goal was to provoke him, it did not work. Nemesio remained as elusive as ever, directing his organization from the shadows. Some reports suggested that he suffered from health problems, possibly a kidney condition, which might have made him even more cautious about his movements. Others speculated that his increasing isolation was making him paranoid, unwilling to trust even longtime allies. For the people living in CJNG-controlled areas, the manhunt brought mixed emotions. Some saw El Mencho as a necessary evil, a figure who brought order and jobs to forgotten regions. Others lived in fear, knowing that each raid, each military operation, could turn their town into a battlefield. To them, El Mencho was both protector and curse, a man whose very presence invited conflict with the state. In the United States, his name became a symbol of the evolving drug war. Law enforcement briefings described him as more dangerous than El Chapo, pointing out that CJNG was not just a cartel but a highly disciplined paramilitary organization. Congressional hearings referenced him as a top threat, and newspapers ran headlines asking how one man could evade capture for so long despite the full weight of two governments hunting him. As the years passed, the legend of El Mencho only grew. Every failed raid, every near miss, every escape added to his reputation as a ghost who could not be caught. His 10 million bounty remained unclaimed, a testament to both his careful planning and the fierce loyalty of those who protected him. For Nemesio, this was both a triumph and a burden. The higher his profile grew, the more pressure mounted, and the smaller the margins for error became. The international manhunt was no longer just about one man, it had become a symbol of the larger war between the state and organized crime. Each side was determined not to lose. For the government, capturing El Mencho would send a message that no one was beyond their reach. For Nemesio, staying free was proof that he could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast entire governments. And so the game continued, a deadly cat-and-mouse pursuit across mountains, villages, and safe houses. Each side waited for the other to slip. Each side knew that the end would come eventually, but until then, El Mencho remained at large, a ghost in the hills, watching, waiting, and planning his next move. Life on the run has a way of shaping a man, hollowing him out, turning each day into an exercise in discipline and survival. For Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, this existence became a way of life. After years of raids, near captures, and escalating pressure from Mexican and U.S. authorities, El Mencho vanished almost completely from public view. He became a shadow in the hills, a figure who seemed to live more in rumor than in reality. His very absence became his greatest protection and his most powerful weapon. The mountains of Jalisco became his kingdom, not of palaces and towers but of hidden trails, remote safe houses, and fortified camps. These were not the mountains that tourists visited. These were rugged, unforgiving places, thick with forest and nearly impenetrable to outsiders. Helicopters could sweep overhead, but the dense canopy often concealed everything below. Dirt roads wound like veins through the hills, easy to block with burned-out vehicles or booby traps if soldiers tried to advance. It was a perfect terrain for a man who wanted to disappear. Reports from intelligence sources suggested that El Mencho moved constantly, rarely spending more than a night or two in the same place. His safe houses were simple but heavily guarded, often located near natural escape routes, rivers, caves, or narrow passes that could be used to slip away if a raid came too close. Locals were said to act as lookouts, forming an invisible ring of surveillance that could spot strangers long before they reached him. A military convoy entering the area might trigger a chain of messages, passed from village to village until it reached Nemesio's inner circle, giving him precious time to vanish. His personal security was legendary. El Mencho was said to travel with an armed detail of elite sicarios, men who owed him absolute loyalty. These were not ordinary gunmen but highly trained guards, sometimes wearing tactical gear, always armed with heavy weapons. They formed a moving perimeter around him, scouting ahead, watching every road, every hillside. If a threat appeared, they could buy him the minutes he needed to escape into the wilderness. Unlike some cartel leaders who surrounded themselves with dozens of bodyguards and flaunted their power, Nemesio preferred a smaller, more controlled team. The fewer people who knew his location, the better. Even within CJNG, only a handful of top lieutenants reportedly had direct access to him. Orders were relayed through layers of trusted intermediaries, often using face-to-face communication rather than phones or radios to avoid interception. This life required sacrifice. There were no grand parties, no public celebrations, no open displays of luxury. Nemesio lived quietly, eating simply, maintaining a low profile even among his own men. Some reports claimed he avoided alcohol, kept strict routines, and even engaged in physical exercise to stay fit, a man constantly preparing for the possibility that he might have to run at a moment's notice. Rumors swirled about his health. Some said he suffered from kidney problems that required treatment, speculating that he occasionally left the mountains to receive medical care in secret clinics. Others doubted these claims, suggesting they were planted deliberately to mislead authorities. Whatever the truth, the mystery only deepened his legend. Each sighting, each fragment of intelligence, was weighed carefully by those hunting him, but more often than not, they found themselves chasing ghosts. For the people who lived in the regions where El Mencho was believed to hide, his presence was both a blessing and a curse. Some saw him as a protector who kept rival gangs away and provided occasional aid to the community, food deliveries, money for local festivals, even infrastructure improvements like paving roads. Others lived in fear, knowing that harboring such a powerful figure meant that their town could become a target for government raids or rival attacks. Yet few dared to speak openly. In places where CJNG held sway, silence was the rule. El Mencho's life on the run was not just about avoiding capture, it was about maintaining control. Even from the mountains, he remained deeply involved in CJNG's operations. Orders went out for territorial expansion, for the defense of routes, for retaliation against enemies. His lieutenants carried out these commands faithfully, keeping the organization running smoothly despite the leader's physical absence from the front lines. This ability to direct a global empire from hiding was one of the things that most impressed and frustrated law enforcement. Each time authorities believed they were close, Nemesio slipped through their fingers. Raids turned up weapons, cash, vehicles, but not him. It was as though he could sense when danger was near, vanishing before the first helicopter touched down. Some in law enforcement began to speak of him almost superstitiously, as though he possessed an uncanny sixth sense. This constant movement took its toll, but it also kept him alive. Many cartel leaders before him had fallen because they grew complacent, staying too long in one place, trusting too many people, exposing themselves to surveillance. Nemesio refused to make the same mistakes. His life might have been lonely, but it was calculated to maximize his chances of survival. At night, in the highlands of Jalisco, one could imagine him sitting by a small fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, his security detail posted at the edges of the camp. Somewhere in the distance, a dog might bark, or a branch might snap, and every man would tense, fingers resting on the triggers of their rifles. This was not a life of comfort, it was a life of constant vigilance, a life where every sound, every shadow, might signal danger. And yet, there was power in this invisibility. Each day that passed without his capture added to the myth of El Mencho. To his enemies, he was a frustrating phantom who defied the combined strength of two governments. To his allies, he was proof that discipline and patience could outwit even the most determined manhunt. His absence became a presence, a reminder that somewhere out there, in the dark hills, the most wanted man in the Americas was still free. This ghostly existence was both a testament to Nemesio's skill and a reflection of the world he had built. CJNG thrived not in spite of his absence, but because of it, because he had built an organization that could function like a machine even when its leader was hidden. For Nemesio, the mountains were not just a hiding place, they were a throne, and from that throne, he continued to rule. Behind the myth of El Mencho, behind the guns, the convoys, and the headlines, there was always something quieter holding the empire together, family. For Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, blood was not merely a bond, it was a shield, a source of loyalty, and, at times, a weakness that authorities would exploit in their relentless pursuit of him. To understand CJNG fully, one must understand the Oseguera and Gonzalez Valencia families, for they are as deeply embedded in the story as Nemesio himself. At the center of that family circle is Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, El Mencho's wife. Known as La Jefa, the boss lady, Rosalinda was not a passive figure standing in the shadows. She came from the powerful Gonzalez Valencia clan, a family with deep roots in the drug trade. Her brothers were key players in the Milenio cartel before its fragmentation, and their connections helped Nemesio rise within the organization. Marrying Rosalinda was not just a personal union, it was a strategic alliance that tied Nemesio to one of the most influential criminal dynasties in western Mexico. Rosalinda was often described as elegant, intelligent, and deeply loyal to her husband. While Nemesio built CJNG's military and logistical power, Rosalinda reportedly helped manage the financial side of the organization. Authorities accused her of overseeing a network of front companies, restaurants, agricultural businesses, real estate holdings that laundered millions of dollars in cartel profits. In 2018, she was arrested by Mexican authorities and charged with money laundering, a move intended to strike at the heart of CJNG's financial infrastructure. Her arrest was a symbolic blow, but within months, she was released on bail, sparking outrage from those who saw her as a key figure in the cartel's operations. Rosalinda's influence extended beyond finances. For CJNG members, she represented the matriarch of the organization, a figure whose status commanded respect. Her relationship with Nemesio was said to be strong and enduring, a partnership forged over decades of danger, flight, and survival. Those who knew them described a deep bond, one that grounded El Mencho even as the world hunted him. Together, Nemesio and Rosalinda had children, and those children would grow to play roles of their own within the cartel. Their son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, better known as El Menchito, was widely considered the heir apparent to CJNG. From a young age, Ruben was involved in the family business, allegedly overseeing operations, coordinating shipments, and learning the ropes of leadership. His rise within CJNG was swift, and by his 20s, he was regarded as second in command, effectively running parts of the cartel in his father's absence. But Ruben's prominence also made him a target. In 2014, he was arrested by Mexican authorities on suspicion of drug trafficking and weapons charges, though he was later released. His freedom was short-lived. In 2015, he was arrested again, and this time, after a lengthy legal battle, he was extradited to the United States in 2020 to face federal drug trafficking charges. His capture was a major victory for U.S. law enforcement, but it also left CJNG with questions about succession. El Mencho's daughter, Jessica Johanna Oseguera, also came under scrutiny. She was accused of managing several businesses tied to CJNG's financial network, including restaurants and tequila companies. In 2020, Jessica was arrested while attending her brother's court hearing in Washington, D.C., and later sentenced to prison for violating the Kingpin Act by conducting business with sanctioned entities linked to her father's cartel. These arrests were part of a larger strategy by authorities to pressure Nemesio by targeting those closest to him. The hope was that isolating him from his family, dismantling his financial networks, and imprisoning his potential successor would weaken CJNG's ability to operate. Yet the cartel showed remarkable resilience, continuing its expansion even as its top family members were arrested. For Nemesio, these attacks on his family must have cut deeper than any military raid. Those who have studied his psychology suggest that family is one of the few things capable of stirring him emotionally. While he is described as cold and calculating in business, his protective instincts toward his wife and children are said to be fierce. Some speculate that the arrests of Rosalinda, Ruben, and Jessica only hardened his resolve to remain free, to continue leading CJNG from the shadows despite the escalating pressure. Beyond his immediate household, Nemesio's extended family also plays a role. The Gonzalez Valencia clan remains influential, with surviving brothers and cousins believed to hold senior positions within CJNG. This tight-knit network of blood relatives creates a layer of loyalty that is difficult for authorities to penetrate. Outsiders can be bribed or flipped, but family, at least in Nemesio's world, is expected to remain loyal to the end. This use of family as the backbone of the organization is not unique to CJNG. Many cartels and mafias throughout history have relied on bloodlines to ensure trust and continuity. But in Nemesio's case, it goes beyond practicality. Family is part of his identity, a reminder of where he came from and why he chose the path he did. The boy who grew up in Aguililla helping his family survive had built an empire that now supported not just his household but entire communities that depended on CJNG's money. And yet, family ties also make him vulnerable. Every arrest, every indictment, every frozen asset brings him closer to the possibility of losing the very people he fought to protect. This vulnerability has forced Nemesio to make difficult choices, to stay hidden, to keep moving, to limit contact even with those he loves most. The life of a fugitive is lonely, and for El Mencho, that loneliness is compounded by the knowledge that every reunion, every moment of closeness, carries the risk of betrayal or discovery. Still, in the quiet of the mountains where he hides, one imagines that thoughts of family are never far from his mind. Perhaps at night, when the campfire burns low and the guards keep watch under the stars, Nemesio allows himself a moment to think of Rosalinda, of Ruben in a distant prison cell, of Jessica far away, and of the world he has built for them, a world that continues to move at his command even as he remains a ghost. Power in the world of cartels is not just measured by territory or revenue, it is measured by fear. And fear was something CJNG understood with terrifying clarity. Under Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the cartel did not simply fight its enemies, it turned violence into a language, into a form of communication that spoke louder than any press release or public statement. Through carefully staged acts of terror, CJNG announced to the world that they were not merely another cartel, they were a force to be reckoned with. Power that would not hesitate to use any means necessary to protect its interests. These displays were designed to be unforgettable. Bodies left on roadsides were not hidden but posed in deliberate arrangements, sometimes accompanied by narcomentas, large banners bearing messages that warned rivals, taunted authorities, or justified CJNG's actions as cleansing the region of criminals. It was macabre theater, and the entire country was forced to watch. One of the most chilling tactics employed by CJNG was the public execution of rivals. Victims were sometimes hanged from bridges in busy towns, their bodies swinging in the morning light as commuters passed below. It was a brutal reminder to anyone thinking of challenging CJNG's rule. In other cases, videos surfaced online showing interrogations of captured enemies, followed by executions. These recordings, often filmed with high-definition cameras, were not chaotic acts of violence but methodically staged productions. Masked gunmen stood in formation, weapons polished, voices calm as they delivered their messages before carrying out the killings. This was psychological warfare. Nemesio understood that every act of violence carried to audiences, the immediate victim and everyone else who would hear about it. By making these acts public, CJNG magnified their impact. Rivals would think twice before entering CJNG territory. Communities would think twice before cooperating with law enforcement. Even government officials, judges, and police officers were not immune to the chilling effect of CJNG's reputation. But CJNG's violence was not mindless. It had a purpose, and that purpose was control. In many regions, the cartel targeted those who threatened their business, rival gangs, police who refused bribes, or individuals accused of theft or betrayal. To some, this created a perverse sense of order. Petty crime dropped in CJNG-controlled towns because everyone knew that punishment would be swift and final. In this way, CJNG blurred the line between cartel and vigilant force, presenting themselves as enforcers of justice even as they committed atrocities. The scale of the bloodshed was staggering. Entire convoys of police were ambushed and wiped out in coordinated attacks. In 2015, an ambush in Jalisco killed 15 police officers, one of the deadliest attacks on law enforcement in Mexico's modern history. Roads were blocked with burning vehicles, creating scenes of chaos and panic. These were not random acts, they were carefully timed strikes meant to send a message to the government: CJNG would not back down. CJNG also weaponized social media in ways few other cartels had done before. Their videos were circulated widely online, reaching audiences far beyond the immediate conflict zones. In these videos, their fighters appeared in matching uniforms, often standing beside armored trucks and heavy weapons, chanting slogans and pledging loyalty to El Mencho. These clips served a dual purpose: they were propaganda to recruit new members, and they were psychological tools to terrify rivals and authorities alike. The cartel's brutality became so notorious that their name alone was enough to instill fear. In some towns, people would lower their voices when speaking of CJNG, afraid that even mentioning them too loudly might invite trouble. The mere rumor of CJNG presence could empty a bar, shut down a market, or send families fleeing to other states. Fear became a kind of invisible fence, keeping rivals and law enforcement at bay without a shot being fired. Yet within this darkness, there was a strange contradiction. While CJNG ruled through terror, they also occasionally engaged in acts that could be interpreted as benevolent. During the COVID-19 pandemic, videos circulated of CJNG operatives distributing boxes of food and supplies to poor communities, with the packages labeled as gifts from El Mencho himself. It was a calculated move, a reminder that CJNG could be both executioner and benefactor, punisher and provider. This dual image made the cartel even harder to combat, because in some areas, they were seen not just as criminals but as the de facto authority. The psychological impact of CJNG's campaigns extended beyond Mexico. Their brutality captured international headlines, reinforcing their reputation as one of the most dangerous cartels in the world. For Nemesio, this global infamy was both a weapon and a liability. It kept rivals at bay, but it also ensured that every government agency, from the DEA to Europol, had his name circled in red. For the ordinary people caught in the middle, CJNG's reign of fear meant living with constant uncertainty. Farmers worried about being extorted. Truck drivers feared being stopped at cartel checkpoints. Parents feared that their sons might be recruited, or that their refusal might result in punishment. Each day was a balancing act between survival and silence. And yet, through all of this, El Mencho remained unseen. His voice rarely, if ever, appeared in the videos. His image was absent from the banners. It was as though he orchestrated the entire campaign from behind a curtain, pulling the strings while remaining invisible. This only added to his mystique, turning him into a figure more feared precisely because he could not be found. CJNG's legacy of terror is one of its most enduring marks on Mexico's drug war. Their methods reshaped the conflict, forcing both rivals and the government to adapt to a cartel that was as skilled at psychological operations as it was at direct combat. For Nemesio, this was not cruelty for its own sake, it was strategy, and it worked. CJNG's dominance grew, and their control over territory solidified. But there was a cost. Every act of terror created more enemies, more pressure, more determination from the government to bring him down. Each banner, each ambush, each viral video brought Nemesio closer to the day when someone would finally find him. The more terrifying CJNG became, the more the world resolved to hunt its leader. And so, the shadow he cast grew longer, darker. To this day, the name CJNG carries with it a chill, a reminder of the bridges draped with bodies, the highways blocked by burning trucks, the videos that appeared unbidden on phone screens. It is a legacy written in fear, and it is a legacy that Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes continues to write from the shadows of the mountains he calls home. Power alone cannot sustain a cartel. Bullets may win territory, but it is money that keeps an empire alive. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes understood this better than most. For all of CJNG's brutality on the battlefield, its true strength lay in its ability to turn illicit profits into a web of legitimate assets that were far harder to trace, seize, or dismantle. The transformation of dirty money into clean wealth became one of the most sophisticated aspects of CJNG's operation, a shadow economy that stretched from rural Mexico to glittering international markets. The process began at the source. The billions generated by methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl shipments. These profits arrived in cash, stacks upon stacks of US dollars smuggled back across the border, sometimes hidden in vehicles, sometimes carried by couriers, sometimes wired through underground banking networks known as Hawala or peso exchange. This cash was the lifeblood of CJNG, but it was also dangerous. Large amounts of unlaundered money could draw attention. If discovered, it could be seized, and with it, months of work could be lost. To solve this, Nemesio relied on a sophisticated laundering network, one that used both traditional methods and modern innovations. At the street level, money was often broken down into smaller deposits and funneled into the banking system through a technique known as structuring, designed to avoid triggering reporting requirements. Other times, bulk cash was smuggled back to Mexico, where it was used to purchase real estate, vehicles, or legitimate businesses that could justify large cash flows. Front companies were a key part of CJNG's financial machine. Restaurants, bars, construction firms, trucking companies, and agricultural operations became conduits for laundering profits. These businesses often operated like any other legitimate enterprise, serving real customers, hiring local workers, paying taxes, but behind the scenes, they were mixing illegal earnings with legitimate revenue, making it nearly impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Agriculture was particularly useful. In Michoacán and Jalisco, CJNG invested heavily in avocado farms, lemon groves, and other cash crops. Produce shipments could conceal drug loads heading north and return with bulk cash hidden among legitimate goods. The farms themselves also acted as a financial shield, generating income that appeared clean on paper. In some cases, CJNG even provided security for local farmers for a price, further cementing their influence over rural economies. Real estate was another favorite tool. CJNG operatives purchased homes, apartments, and commercial buildings, often in the names of relatives or shell corporations. These properties not only laundered money, but also provided safe houses for operatives and storage locations for weapons or cash. In Guadalajara, authorities uncovered luxury residences linked to CJNG figures, discreet mansions tucked away behind high walls, quiet on the outside but lavishly furnished within. The cartel also used more complex financial schemes, including trade-based money laundering. Goods were imported and exported with manipulated invoices, allowing CJNG to move value across borders under the guise of legitimate commerce. In some cases, they overvalued goods being shipped to launder more money, in others, they undervalued imports to hide profits. This level of sophistication required accountants, lawyers, and business professionals who were willing to work with the cartel, sometimes under threat, sometimes for a share of the profits. At the top of this financial network, according to prosecutors, stood Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, Nemesio's wife. Known as La Jefa, she was accused of coordinating much of the cartel's laundering through a network of front companies. Her arrest in 2018 was widely interpreted as a direct attack on CJNG's financial brain. Yet even after her capture, the network continued to function, proof of how deeply it had been built into the legitimate economy. Money laundering was not just a means of hiding profits, it was also a weapon of influence. By investing in communities, CJNG bought loyalty and silence. In some towns, The cartel funded church renovations, sponsored local festivals, or provided loans to struggling farmers. These acts blurred the moral lines for locals, who came to see CJNG not merely as a criminal group but as a source of stability in regions long neglected by the state. The wealth also bought protection in higher places. Corruption was one of CJNG's most powerful tools. Bribes flowed to municipal police, judges, customs officials, and even federal agents. These payments ensured that shipments could move without interference, that cases could disappear, that warnings could be given before raids. In some instances, entire local governments were compromised, turning towns into safe zones where CJNG could operate freely. Internationally, the cartel made use of global financial systems to move its profits. Investigations uncovered links to bank accounts and businesses in Europe, Asia, and South America. Shell companies incorporated in tax havens acted as waypoints for funds, making it nearly impossible to follow the money trail back to its criminal source. By the time authorities identified an account, the money had often already been moved again, leaving behind a paper trail that led to yet another shell entity. For Nemesio, this financial empire was more than just a way to enjoy his wealth. It was a shield. Even as he lived a fugitive's life in the mountains, his money moved freely through cities and countries he would never set foot in. This invisible network ensured that CJNG could pay its soldiers, buy weapons, and bribe officials even if Nemesio himself was completely cut off. Yet there was always a danger in success. The more CJNG's wealth grew, the more attention it attracted from financial intelligence units in Mexico, the United States, and beyond. Sanctions were imposed on individuals and businesses linked to the cartel, freezing accounts and seizing properties. Each seizure was a small victory for law enforcement, but for every asset taken, others remained hidden, waiting to be used. This endless game of cat and mouse mirrored Nemesio's own life, always moving, always one step ahead, never fully caught. Money, like its master, seemed to vanish when cornered, reappearing somewhere else, still at work, still fueling the engine of CJNG's empire. In the end, Nemesio's greatest weapon may not have been his guns or his sicarios, but his ability to make his fortune disappear into the global economy, to turn blood-stained cash into something indistinguishable from the profits of legitimate commerce. It was this financial invisibility that made him not just hard to catch but hard to stop. The higher Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes climbed, the smaller his world became. Power had made him rich, powerful, and feared, but it had also made him a prisoner of his own empire. For El Mencho, every day was now a balancing act between control and survival, between ruling a vast cartel and staying alive long enough to enjoy the fruits of his labor. The longer he stayed free, the more the pressure mounted, and with it came the creeping shadow of paranoia. He could no longer trust freely, not even those closest to him. Betrayal had destroyed many men before him, and Nemesio had studied their mistakes well. He knew that informants lurked in every corner, that governments offered rewards large enough to tempt even the most loyal lieutenant. As a result, he kept his circle tighter than ever, reducing contact to only a few trusted operatives and family members. Meetings were rare, carefully planned, often held in remote locations where access could be controlled. Even then, precautions were taken, phones left behind, routes changed at the last moment, escape plans rehearsed. His paranoia was not unfounded. Authorities had raided dozens of safe houses, arrested family members, and intercepted communications. Rivals had tried to assassinate him, planting rumors of his death more than once. Every step Nemesio took had to be calculated, every decision weighed not only for its business implications but for its potential to expose him. The mountains where he hid were no longer just a refuge, they were a labyrinth, a fortress where every path had to be known, every exit kept clear. This constant vigilance took its toll. Though he maintained a strict routine to keep his body and mind sharp, the stress of being hunted must have pressed on him like a physical weight. Imagine the nights in those remote camps, the crackle of a fire, the stillness of the forest, and Nemesio lying awake, listening to every sound, wondering if tonight would be the night that helicopters appeared on the horizon. Sleep could never be fully restful when danger might descend at any hour. Reports suggested that El Mencho rotated between multiple hideouts, some deep in the Sierra de Jalisco, others scattered across Michoacán and Colima. These were not luxurious mansions, but humble ranches or fortified cabins designed for utility rather than comfort. Each location was stocked with supplies, escape routes mapped out, and armed guards posted at key vantage points. If authorities got too close, Nemesio could vanish into the hills, leaving behind little more than empty rooms and scattered footprints. This life of constant motion created a sense of isolation. While his cartel continued to expand and his lieutenants executed his orders, Nemesio himself was becoming more and more detached from the world beyond the mountains. To stay safe, he had to limit his contact even with those he trusted, which meant that much of the day-to-day work of CJNG was delegated. In some ways, this made him stronger, the cartel could function without him, but in others, it deepened his solitude. Isolation and power are a dangerous combination. Some who have studied Nemesio's rise believe that this isolation sharpened his focus but also intensified his suspicions. Each betrayal by a captured operative, each failed raid, each news report about his family's arrests must have reinforced the belief that danger was everywhere. For a man like El Mencho, paranoia was not a weakness, it was a survival mechanism. Yet it also risked cutting him off from the very networks that kept him informed. His paranoia extended even to communication. He avoided cell phones and digital messaging whenever possible, relying instead on trusted couriers who could deliver messages by hand. When he did use electronics, they were reportedly burned or discarded after brief use to avoid tracking. Meetings were often scheduled in the last possible moment, routes altered to prevent ambushes, and security sweeps conducted constantly to check for surveillance equipment. This level of caution made him nearly impossible to catch, but it also meant living with constant tension. Every visitor had to be vetted, every ally watched carefully. Even celebrations, the rare moments when his men might have wanted to gather and honor a victory, were likely subdued, private affairs, stripped of any chance that an informant or undercover operative might slip through the door. The psychological toll of such a life is hard to imagine. Nemesio had power, but he could not use it openly. He had money, but he could not spend it freely. He had family, but he could rarely see them. The world had become both his empire and his cage. Still, El Mencho seemed to thrive under these conditions. His discipline became almost legendary, his ability to evade capture earning him a reputation as untouchable. Each failed raid, each close call, became a kind of victory, proof that he was still one step ahead of the armies hunting him. This, too, fed his myth. To his followers, he was not just a boss but a ghost who could not be caught, a man whose very survival was evidence of destiny. But Nemesio must have known that no man stays ahead forever. Each passing year tightened the noose a little more. Technology improved. Drones flew higher. Satellites saw more. Informants multiplied. Even the most careful plan could be undone by a single mistake, a single trusted aide who chose betrayal over loyalty. And so he kept moving, kept hiding, kept planning, always aware that the end could come suddenly and violently. Perhaps at times, he allowed himself to think about the future, not just his own, but that of CJNG. Would his son take over if he were captured or killed? Would the cartel hold together, or would it splinter like millennia before it? These thoughts must have weighed on him as he sat in those mountain hideouts, staring into the fire. Paranoia is not just fear of the present, it is fear of what comes next. And yet, for all the fear, Nemesio remained defiant. He was not content merely to hide. Even from the shadows, he continued to direct CJNG's expansion, ordering hits, approving shipments, and orchestrating moves that shaped the drug war across Mexico. The hunted man was still a hunter, and his paranoia, rather than crippling him, seemed to make him sharper, more dangerous, more determined to stay free. By the mid-2010s, the Mexican government could no longer ignore the storm that CJNG had become. What had started as a regional faction had grown into a national force, controlling trafficking routes, ports, and entire towns with a combination of terror and discipline. The ambushes, the public displays of violence, and the downing of a military helicopter had humiliated the state and made one thing clear: CJNG was no longer just a cartel, it was an insurgent force challenging the authority of the government itself. For President Enrique Peña Nieto's administration, and later Andrés Manuel López Obrador's, the message was unmistakable. El Mencho had to be taken down. The government began deploying its most elite units, the Mexican Marines, who had already been instrumental in capturing capos like Arturo Beltrán Leyva and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. These were not ordinary police forces, but highly trained special operations troops, equipped with helicopters, armored vehicles, and intelligence support from the United States. Their mission was clear: find El Mencho, dismantle CJNG's leadership, and restore control of the state of Jalisco. The first major operation came in 2015 and was codenamed Operation Jalisco. It was an unprecedented effort, involving hundreds of Marines, federal police, and soldiers sweeping through the region. Roadblocks were set up, air support was deployed, and dozens of suspected CJNG members were arrested. But CJNG responded with a ferocity that shocked even hardened observers of Mexico's drug war. On 1 May 2015, CJNG launched a counteroffensive unlike anything the country had seen before. Gunmen blocked dozens of roads across Jalisco, Michoacán, and Colima by hijacking buses and trucks, setting them ablaze to paralyze security forces. Banks and gas stations were attacked. And in a stunning act of defiance, CJNG fighters used a rocket-propelled grenade to shoot down a Mexican army helicopter near Villa Purification, killing several soldiers and forcing the aircraft to make an emergency landing. This was more than just resistance, it was a declaration of war. The government had expected to face scattered gunmen. Instead, they encountered a cartel capable of coordinated, military-style operations. The message from Nemesio was clear: any attempt to capture him would come at a high cost. The siege continued for hours, leaving smoke and burning vehicles across multiple states. For the first time, many Mexicans began to speak of CJNG not just as a cartel but as something closer to an insurgency, capable of challenging the state's monopoly on violence. Operation Jalisco failed to capture El Mencho, and he slipped away once again, vanishing into the mountains before authorities could corner him. In the years that followed, the government launched additional offensives, each one designed to disrupt CJNG's leadership structure. Safe houses were raided, lieutenants were captured, and millions in cash and weapons were seized. Yet for every blow dealt, CJNG seemed to absorb the hit and grow stronger. The cartel's decentralized but disciplined structure allowed it to replace fallen commanders quickly, keeping operations running with little disruption. The pressure intensified with international cooperation. The United States provided intelligence support, surveillance capabilities, and financial tracking tools to help dismantle CJNG's networks. Joint task forces were formed, and rewards for information leading to El Mencho's capture were publicized widely. His 10 million bounty became one of the highest ever offered for a cartel leader, a clear sign of how seriously he was being pursued. But Nemesio adapted. His security protocols became even tighter. Reports indicated that he rarely used vehicles that could be tracked, preferring to travel by foot, motorcycle, or even horseback through remote terrain. He kept his locations secret until the last possible moment, and his men used counter-surveillance teams to monitor the movements of authorities. In some cases, they reportedly planted roadblocks or traps to delay advancing troops, buying him enough time to escape. CJNG also fought back directly. When the government arrested or killed one of Nemesio's top lieutenants, the cartel often retaliated violently. In Guanajuato, where CJNG clashed with local gangs and security forces, waves of killings followed government operations. Police officers were ambushed, and narco banners were hung threatening anyone who collaborated with the state. These reprisals served as both revenge and deterrence, making some officials think twice about participating in future raids. The battles between CJNG and the government turned entire regions into war zones. Villagers sometimes fled as convoys of cartel trucks and military vehicles exchanged fire on highways. Helicopters circled overhead, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the hills. Each clash brought headlines, but each clash also ended with the same outcome: Nemesio was not among the captured. This pattern created frustration both in Mexico and abroad. For years, the government had been able to claim major victories by capturing or killing top capos. El Chapo had been arrested twice and eventually extradited. The Beltran Leyva brothers were dead or in prison. Los Zetas had been fragmented. Yet El Mencho remained free, his organization arguably stronger than any of the others at their peak. The government's offensives also carried unintended consequences. The heavy military presence in Jalisco sometimes sparked resentment among locals, who saw soldiers as outsiders bringing violence into their communities. Some even preferred CJNG's rule, which, for all its brutality, provided a form of order and economic opportunity. This complicated the state's efforts, as intelligence gathering relied heavily on local cooperation. Despite the setbacks, the operations continued year after year. More laboratories were discovered and destroyed, more shipments seized, more arrests made. But the man at the center of it all remained untouchable. Each failure seemed to enhance his legend, turning him into a near mythical figure, the capo who could not be caught. For Nemesio, these government offensives were a test of both his leadership and his patience. Each raid forced him deeper into isolation, each near capture reminding him how narrow the margin for error had become. Yet each successful escape also reinforced his belief in his strategy, convincing him that discipline, secrecy, and mobility were enough to keep him one step ahead. By the end of the decade, CJNG stood bloodied but unbroken. The Mexican government had thrown everything it could at the cartel, and still it endured. The siege of Jalisco had not toppled El Mencho. If anything, it had solidified his reputation as a man who could stare down the state and survive. But the pressure was not going away. If anything, it was growing. Every year brought new offensives, new intelligence, new technology designed to find him. For Nemesio, the game was far from over, and he knew that the next move, like all the ones before it, would have to be played carefully. In the world of organized crime, legends often grow faster than facts. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the quiet man from Aguililla who rose to lead the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, was no exception. By the late 2010s, El Mencho had become something larger than life, his name spoken with a mixture of fear, awe, and reluctant respect. He was no longer merely a man, he was a myth, a figure whose story blurred the line between reality and rumor. The myth of El Mencho was born partly from his invisibility. For years, the world had almost no confirmed images of him. Unlike Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who had been photographed repeatedly and even gave interviews, Nemesio seemed to vanish from the public record. There were no leaked videos of him partying, no tabloid spreads of him flaunting luxury. This absence only made him more enigmatic. People filled the void with speculation, imagining him as everything from a humble, disciplined recluse to a ruthless, calculating general who never slept. His elusiveness gave rise to whispered stories, some likely true, others pure invention. Locals in Jalisco told tales of how El Mencho would appear suddenly in a village, hand out money to families, fund church repairs, then disappear before dawn. Others swore they had seen him at cockfights, quietly watching from a corner, blending in so well that few realized who he was until he was gone. Whether these stories were real or exaggerated hardly mattered. They painted a picture of a man who could walk among the people as one of them, even as he commanded an empire feared across continents. The narco ballad tradition, narco corridos, also played a role in building his legend. These songs, popular in northern Mexico, told the stories of drug lords in the style of folk heroes. Ballads about El Mencho praised his cunning, his generosity to the poor, and his ability to outwit the government. They portrayed him as a man who had defied the odds, who had taken on powerful rivals and won. To some listeners, he became a kind of anti-hero, a symbol of resistance against a system that had failed rural Mexico for generations. But the myth was not built on admiration alone, it was also built on fear. CJNG's acts of terror became part of the El Mencho legend, each banner, each ambush, each mass killing adding to the image of a man who would stop at nothing to protect his power. Even those who had never seen him firsthand spoke of him with a kind of hushed reverence, as though saying his name too loudly might draw unwanted attention. Online forums and social media amplified this aura. Videos of CJNG convoys, heavily armed and disciplined, circulated widely, with viewers marveling at their organization and firepower. Memes, rumors, and speculative posts turned El Mencho into a character larger than reality, a ghostly figure who could be anywhere, directing one of the world's deadliest criminal enterprises with flawless precision. For many, this myth had a dark allure. Some young men in poor towns saw CJNG as a path to power, a way to escape poverty, and El Mencho as the ultimate example of someone who had made it. Recruitment videos sometimes leaned into this narrative, showing CJNG as a disciplined, almost military brotherhood where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was punished. And yet, there was always a line between the myth and the man. Those who had truly encountered Nemesio described him not as a flamboyant warlord but as a calm, almost soft-spoken figure. He was said to be respectful, careful with his words, and rarely prone to displays of temper. This quietness, this sense of control, only deepened the respect his men felt for him. In a world often ruled by impulsive violence, El Mencho's restraint made him seem more formidable, not less. His ability to evade capture became one of the central pillars of his legend. Every time a major raid failed to catch him, every time authorities claimed they were close only for him to slip away, the myth grew. Some began to say he could never be caught, that he had informants everywhere, that even the trees themselves whispered when soldiers approached. To those who hunted him, this was maddening. To those who followed him, it was proof that he was destined to lead. The legend of El Mencho extended beyond Mexico's borders. International media portrayed him as the most dangerous man alive, the kingpin who had risen to challenge even the once dominant Sinaloa cartel. Headlines called CJNG Mexico's most powerful cartel, and Nemesio was frequently compared to figures like Escobar and El Chapo, with one critical difference: he remained free. This comparison elevated him to a pantheon of criminal icons, but also turned him into a symbol of the state's inability to impose order. In some ways, El Mencho became a mirror for Mexico itself. To some, he represented the failures of government, the corruption and neglect that allowed cartels to flourish. To others, he represented opportunity, the chance to seize power in a world that had offered them nothing. His story was not just about one man but about the forces that had shaped him: poverty, violence, and the insatiable demand for drugs that fueled the entire trade. Of course, the myth also carried danger. Being larger than life meant that Nemesio was constantly in the crosshairs, not only of the government but of rival cartels eager to claim the glory of killing or capturing him. Every act of violence attributed to CJNG added to his notoriety, making him a bigger target. But Nemesio seemed to embrace this paradox. The fear his name inspired kept rivals cautious, kept communities silent, and kept authorities on edge. At night, in the villages of Jalisco, the legend of El Mencho is still told in low voices. Parents warn their children to stay indoors when convoys pass. Farmers thank him quietly for protecting their crops. Others curse his name for the blood spilled in their streets. Love him or hate him, no one can ignore him. Legends have a way of outliving the men who inspire them. Whether Nemesio is captured, killed, or dies quietly in the mountains, his story will continue to be told in songs, in whispers, in headlines. The myth of El Mencho is no longer just his own making. It belongs to everyone who has been touched by the fear, the fascination, and the fire of the world he created. Every empire, no matter how fearsome, eventually faces the question of succession. For Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, that question grows heavier with every passing year. El Mencho has evaded capture for over a decade, but time is relentless. He is now in his late 50s, reportedly plagued by health issues, and though he remains at the helm of CJNG, the future of the organization without him is far from certain. The rise of CJNG was meteoric, but its survival after Nemesio will depend on what happens in the moment when the man who built it is no longer there to hold it together. CJNG's strength has always been its discipline and centralized leadership. Nemesio is not just a figurehead, he is the strategist, the organizer, the man whose decisions have kept the cartel unified through years of war and government crackdowns. Without him, there is a very real risk that the organization could fracture, much as the Milenio cartel did before it. Splinter groups could emerge, each led by ambitious lieutenants eager to claim territory, leading to a fresh wave of violence. One name that often surfaces in discussions of succession is Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Mencho. For years, Ruben was groomed as his father's right hand, overseeing operations and commanding respect among CJNG's ranks. His arrest and extradition to the United States, however, removed him from the field and created a power vacuum. If Ruben is ever released, which seems unlikely in the near future, he could attempt to reclaim his place, but until then, CJNG must rely on other figures to maintain cohesion. Among those figures is Odias Flores Silva, alias El Jardinero, considered one of CJNG's most trusted military commanders. Flores has long managed operations in Michoacan and is reputed to be a capable and loyal lieutenant. But loyalty can be fragile when power is at stake, and some analysts believe that if El Mencho were to be captured or killed, Flores and other plaza bosses might prioritize their own survival over maintaining a unified chain of command. CJNG's decentralized structure, once its greatest strength, could also become its greatest vulnerability. The cartel operates like a federation of semi-autonomous cells, each controlling its own territory but answering to the central leadership. This allows CJNG to absorb losses and keep running, but it also means that if the central authority collapses, those cells could go their own way, forming new cartels or waging war against each other for dominance. The Mexican government would likely seize on such a moment to intensify its offensive, seeking to break CJNG apart before a new leader could consolidate control. This is precisely what happened with Los Zetas, whose fragmentation led to years of bloody conflict as rival factions fought for supremacy. A similar scenario with CJNG could plunge Jalisco, Michoacan, and neighboring states into chaos, with violence spilling into cities and disrupting civilian life even more than it already has. There is also the question of external pressure. The United States continues to push for Nemesio's capture, and international efforts to freeze CJNG's assets are ongoing. Each year, more of the cartel's front companies are sanctioned, more lieutenants are arrested or extradited, and more cash is seized. These strikes may not topple CJNG outright, but they weaken its financial base, making it harder to pay soldiers and maintain loyalty. Rivals are watching closely as well. The Sinaloa cartel, long considered Mexico's most powerful criminal organization, remains CJNG's greatest competitor. Though both groups occasionally cooperate to move product, their rivalry has led to brutal clashes across multiple states. If CJNG shows signs of weakness, Sinaloa and other groups would likely seize the opportunity to reclaim lost territory, sparking renewed cartel wars. Some experts argue that CJNG could survive Nemesio's fall if his succession plan is airtight, if he has designated a clear heir and ensured that the organization's most powerful plaza bosses are aligned with that decision. There are rumors that El Mencho has already taken steps to prepare for this eventuality, strengthening the role of loyal family members and lieutenants to maintain continuity. Others doubt this narrative, pointing out that in the world of cartels, alliances shift quickly and loyalty often lasts only as long as the money keeps flowing. The human cost of a post-Mencho transition could be catastrophic. CJNG's sheer size and firepower mean that any internal conflict would not be a quiet affair. Entire towns could become battlegrounds once more, highways choked with burning vehicles, and civilian populations caught between warring factions. The Mexican state, already stretched thin by other security challenges, might find itself unable to contain the violence, leading to a prolonged period of instability. And yet, there is also a possibility that CJNG could endure, even thrive, after Nemesio. If a competent successor emerges and manages to hold the organization together, CJNG could continue to dominate the meth and fentanyl trade, using its established infrastructure to keep profits flowing. Such a scenario would cement CJNG as a multigenerational cartel, one capable of outlasting its founder just as the Sinaloa cartel has survived the imprisonment of El Chapo. For Nemesio himself, these questions must weigh heavily during his quiet moments in hiding. He has built an empire that rivals any in Mexico's history, but he knows that empires are fragile things. He has seen how quickly fortunes can turn, how Milenio collapsed, how Los Zetas shattered, how even the mighty Sinaloa cartel was weakened by El Chapo's capture. Perhaps this is why El Mencho remains so elusive, so focused on survival. Each day he stays free is another day he can shape the future of CJNG, another day he can try to ensure that when his time comes, his legacy will endure. But even the most careful strategist cannot control everything. One betrayal, one raid, one moment of bad luck could change everything overnight. The future of CJNG is therefore a question mark, a looming shadow over Mexico's drug war. Will it splinter and bleed, plunging the country into yet another cycle of violence? Or will it endure and grow, outliving its founder to become the next great criminal dynasty? No one can say for certain. For now, the man who built the empire continues to hide in the mountains, watching, waiting, preparing. He knows the day will come when he can no longer lead, whether by capture, death, or simply the slow erosion of time. When that day comes, the fate of CJNG will be decided not just by its soldiers and its lieutenants, but by the forces that have always shaped Mexico's underworld, ambition, fear, and the unrelenting pursuit of power. As dawn breaks over the mountains of Jalisco, the mist rolls slowly down the slopes, softening the jagged edges of the land. Somewhere out there, perhaps in a hidden ranch house or a tent deep in the wilderness, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes may be awake, watching the sunrise. The man known as El Mencho, the most wanted figure in the Western Hemisphere, has survived another night. For over a decade, he has been hunted by governments, rival cartels, and the relentless ticking of time itself. And yet, as the world stirs from sleep, he remains free, an invisible presence presiding over a vast, shadowy empire. The story of El Mencho is not just the story of a single man, but of an era in which cartels have risen from the margins to become power brokers, where entire regions of Mexico live under their rule, and where governments struggle to reassert control. Nemesio's life mirrors the contradictions of this era. He was a poor farm boy who became a kingpin, a fugitive who built an empire, a ghost who commands armies. His legend is stitched together from facts, rumors, and blood, and it continues to grow even as he moves silently through the hills. For some, El Mencho is the embodiment of everything wrong with Mexico's long fight against organized crime, a man whose power is proof of systemic corruption and state weakness. For others, he is a symbol of defiance, a man who outsmarted the authorities and provided for communities forgotten by the government. This dual image, villain to some, folk hero to others, ensures that his name will not be forgotten, no matter how his story ends. The legacy of CJNG, too, is a complicated one. Under Nemesio's rule, it became one of the most disciplined, most feared, and most profitable criminal organizations in the world. It perfected the art of methamphetamine production, expanded globally, and introduced a new level of militarization to cartel warfare. But it also left behind a trail of terror ambushes, assassinations, mass graves, and the psychological scars of communities caught in the crossfire. Its rise has been as destructive as it has been impressive, leaving behind a country more fractured, more fearful, and more accustomed to living with violence as a daily reality. And yet, even now, the endgame remains elusive. Will El Mencho be captured, like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman before him, and extradited to face trial in the United States? Will he be killed in a firefight, as so many other cartel leaders have been, leaving CJNG to splinter into chaos? Or will he die quietly in the mountains, his death known only to a select few, his myth lingering long after he is gone? The uncertainty of his fate is part of what makes his story so compelling. Listeners and readers are drawn to the mystery, the idea that somewhere, even now, the most wanted man in the Americas is still at large, still issuing orders, still shaping the drug war from the shadows. Each passing day without news of his capture feels like a reminder that the world is not as orderly as we might wish it to be, that power can exist outside the reach of courts and governments. But legends, no matter how powerful, eventually meet their dusk. Perhaps one morning, the headlines will break with the news that Nemesio has finally been captured, that his reign is over, that the ghost of Jalisco has been brought into the light. Or perhaps no such headlines will ever come, and his story will fade into a quiet ending known only to those who were closest to him. Either way, his name will remain etched into the history of Mexico's criminal underworld, a name spoken with fear, fascination, and a certain grim respect. For the people of Jalisco, Michoacan, and beyond, life will go on, as it always does. Markets will open, children will go to school, farmers will tend to their crops. But in some villages, the memory of CJNG convoys rumbling through the streets will never disappear. The memory of gunfire echoing in the hills will linger. And the image of a man who built an empire from nothing, who stood against rivals, governments, and fate itself, will remain part of the collective memory. Perhaps this is the true power of El Mencho's story. Not the violence, not the money, not even the empire he built, but the way his life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It is a story about what happens when poverty, ambition, and opportunity collide. It is a story about the limits of state power, the global demand for drugs, and the human cost of a trade that will not disappear, simply because one man is removed from it. And so, as the sun rises higher over the mountains, we are left with an image, a solitary figure standing on a ridge, looking down at the valleys below. Is he thinking of his family, of the wars he fought, of the empire he built? Or is he simply thinking of survival, of how to stay one step ahead for one more day? The story of El Mencho is not finished, and perhaps it never truly will be. Like all legends, it will continue to be told and retold, shaped by those who lived it and those who merely heard it whispered in the night. It will remain a story of fear and fascination, of power and paranoia, of rise and inevitable fall. And when you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can picture those mountains under the moonlight, quiet and still, holding their secrets close. Somewhere out there, the ghost of Jalisco is still free, watching, waiting, reminding the world that the line between myth and man is thinner than we think.